Thanks, Marcel, and good afternoon from Iqaluit Nunavut, everyone. Please bear with me. We do tend to have some broadband and connectivity issues here in the north. I'll try to do my best to make sure this all goes smoothly, but there are some things I can't control. A few quick reminders. Please raise your hand using the reaction button on the side when you want to ask a question. We'll cycle through media that way based on when you raise your hand. We do have a lot of media registered today, so I apologize in advance if I can't get to your question. We do also plan on ending the press conference at 3:45 Eastern Time sharp. Mute your mic if it's not your turn to ask questions. As Marcel mentioned, when it is your turn to ask questions, please turn on your camera for the benefit of the interpreters. We'll go with one question, one follow-up. Questions are open to all premiers, so please make sure you direct your question to the specific premier you'd like to answer so we can give them the floor. Now I'll let Premier Savikataaq start off the press conference with some opening remarks before we get into questions. Premier Savikataaq, please take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. As the host of this year's Western Premiers Conference, I am sad I couldn't welcome my colleagues to Nunavut, and I hope that someday soon they'll all be able to come and see our beautiful territory. It's truly a place every Canadian should see, the true North, strong and free. I'll quickly review what we discussed and our work to strengthen Canada's West and North. I believe you should all have the communiqué at this point, so I won't take up too much time before we get to your questions. Firstly, we are strongly agreed that hate has no place in Canada and that there is a need to do better for our Indigenous and Muslim communities. Premiers had a lot of discussions around our jurisdiction's post-pandemic health and economic recoveries. Notably, we discussed the many challenges and fiscal and human resources in our health care system. As we find our way out of the third wave, COVID has shown us the limitations of our healthcare system, and we need to find a way to better respond moving forward. We need reoccurring funding through the Canadian healthcare transfer, and we will continue to lobby the federal government on this long-standing issue. We also spoke at length about the issue we have continued to face around mental health and addictions. After 16 months of lockdowns and the anticipated long-term effects that will have in our provinces and territories, we needed dedicated programs and services and funding to help our most vulnerable. We also discussed our economic and how to regain ground in market access and economic and transmission corridors, as well as climate change and building it back better, greener, and cleaner as we recover post-COVID. Electric and other strategies to reduce emissions will be opportunities to fund and fuel our new economy and bring Canada together. Getting products to the market as we balance traditional oil and gas with newer clean hydroelectric energy is key. We look to new and innovation ways to help us move forward. Economic growth is the driver to provide services all Canadians expect and deserve. It is necessary to ensure we balance responsible development, respecting Indigenous lands, with economic development to benefit the West and the North. I'd like to point out the discussions around infrastructure, which is of particular importance to the three territories, especially Nunavut. All jurisdictions in Canada should be connected and have equal access. Our needs are great, and investment from coast to coast to coast is nation building. On that note, I'd be happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Premier. First up, we have James Keller. James, could you please state your outlet and the Premier you'd like to answer before you start your question?
Hi there, it's James Keller with the Globe and Mail here. This is a question, I guess, for all of the premiers. We heard Ontario today is announcing funding for searching of these unmarked burial sites at residential schools. So for each of the premiers, Is your government considering this? And can you give us any specifics on what specifically you're prepared to do as far as funding or resources to make this happen?
Premier
Joe,
Savikataaq, how about you?
Joe, it's Scott here in Saskatchewan. I could begin if other premiers wanted to comment.
All right, Scott, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, in in Saskatchewan, we had a number of Indian residential schools as well, and which is entirely likely that we'll have maybe not to the degree, but a similar situation with some unmarked sites with remains in them here in this province. And so we've been working very closely with our Indigenous communities, with our Provincial Indigenous Representative Organization in the FSIN. We have not committed to any financial funding at this point. However, seeing what Ontario has done today, the federal government has also provided some funding in this space. And but we have committed to providing resources that may be required to ensure that we are able to conduct the work that needs to be conducted in our province, to work alongside and support our Indigenous communities and Indigenous organizations that will be the lead on this work, so that we can start to take some steps to providing all too many families with some closure as to why and why the situation is the way it is, and what precisely may have occurred with their family member, their brother, their sister, or whomever that may be. So we view our position as one of support and providing some resources, yes, if those are required to provide these family members with the first steps of closure that we think they deserve.
Joe, do you mind if I proceed?
I believe,
Okay, it's
believe-
Jason Kenney here. So, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry.
All right. I think that was to me. Okay, so sorry for the technical difficulties here to the media. Thank you for the question, James. The answer is yes. Alberta will be announcing in the days to come a multi-million-dollar package of support for First Nations to help them in their work of identifying any unmarked graves and properly commemorating sites where there were residential schools, where there may be undiscovered remains. Alberta had the largest number of Indian residential schools in the country. As the Truth and Reconciliation Commission underscored, a great deal of work has been done over the years by First Nations and others to help identify remains, but there is probably much more work that still needs to be done. So our Indigenous Relations Minister, Rick Wilson, has been working across the government to assemble a multi-million-dollar package. These will be grants that go to Indigenous organizations for them to decide how best to approach these sensitive issues. Our understanding is that in some cases, some of the nations may not actually want to disturb graves for spiritual reasons. Instead, in some cases, they may simply want to have a permanent form of commemoration. In other cases, they may want to do the full archaeological research that would require cooperation with technical experts, with advanced equipment. In any event, we'll be there to support their choices, and we'll be doing so financially with an announcement detailing that in the days to come.
I believe Premier Horgan and Premier Silver both wanted to speak to this as well, so we'll go with them next.
Yeah, thank you, Kate, and thank you, James, for the question. When we were sworn in as a government in 2017, I issued mandate letters to every minister in government that our obligation was to fulfill the calls to action that were under provincial jurisdiction as a result of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that directive and mandate remains in place. In addition to that, of course, the Kamloops and Secwepemc leadership is dealing with not just a provincial issue here in British Columbia and a national issue, but indeed an international issue. And my hands go up to Chief Casimir and the people of Kamloops who are dealing with this profound shift in how we approach these questions. And We stand ready to take our direction from the leadership of the communities across British Columbia. Some 22 residential schools were in operation in British Columbia. Sandy Silver and I will be in Lower Post to dismantle and destroy the last vestiges of the residential school there. This was in plan well before the revelations from Tk'emlúp's territory, and I believe takes on even greater meaning than ever before. It's going to be a gathering of Indigenous peoples who have been affected as survivors, children of survivors, grandchildren of survivors. And I want to commend my colleagues and the Western Premiers and Northern Premiers for explicitly saying in the communique that although this is very much a black mark on our history, it is felt to this day and will be for the foreseeable future. This is not something that we can turn a page on. It's something that we need to embrace, given direction from Indigenous leadership across certainly British Columbia and indeed across the country. And the resources that are required will be available here in British Columbia.
Thanks, John. And I'll just add to that. In the Yukon, we didn't hesitate when talking with the Deputy Chief of the Daily Dena Council, Deputy Chief Schilling, with the request for us to participate in the residential school tearing down with Premier Horgan. It's going to be a very profound and triggering day, that's for sure. We have a thing called the Yukon Forum here in Yukon, where all the chiefs get together with the ministers, and we talked about the missing generation that was caused by residential school. One of the messages coming out from that table was, you know, we're not going to hesitate. We're thankful that the federal government's coming forth with the $27 million to look into residential schools and these areas, but we're not hesitating. We're going to work with the families first and foremost, and we're going to take the lead from First Nations governments and leadership. The message as well to the religious communities in which these schools were operated under. Don't wait until your jurisdiction becomes a crime scene. We need to share information as much as we possibly can ahead of time, and that's how we as Canadians can hopefully look forward to the next generation with spirit and intent, moving towards somehow moving forward as a nation from our very, very troubling past.
Thanks, Premier Silver. I know that Premier Cochrane also wanted to speak to this, and then I think we'll go on to Richard Zuzman from the Global BC, just so we can get on to some next questions. Thanks so much.
So I want to start by saying that the children that were located in the Kamloops residential school was horrific, not only to Indigenous people, but to most all people throughout Canada, perhaps throughout the world. It did really, Indigenous people have spoken about missing children for decades, and this actually validated it. Can't erase history now. This is a reality. And when I first read it, again, my first instinct was, yes, we need to find the rest of the children. We need to do what we can. However, it was necessary for me to take a step back and recognize within the Truth and Reconciliation, Articles 71 to 76 talk about the missing children and the burial of these children, and state that it shall be led by Indigenous people. It shall not be public governments doing this work. So my commitment has been, and I met with all of the Indigenous leaders just last week, Friday, all governments from the NWT. They will take the direction. They will tell me what to do, and I will lobby with them, and I will stand beside them. But as a public government, it shall not be led by me. It shall be led by the Indigenous governments in the NWT. Thank you.
Thank you, Premier. Richard, you can go ahead. One question, one follow-up. And please name your specific Premier that you'd like to direct the question to.
Yeah, it's Richard Zussman from Global News here. I'll start with Premier Jason Kenney and Premier John Horgan. I understand conversations are happening this week around the Premier's table about reopening the border. I want to get the sense from, we're hearing from some mayors along the border, especially in Ontario, they would like to see the US-Canada border open freely on June 22nd. What are your stances on what you would like to see in terms of recreational travel on the border, and specifically to Premier Horgan, with Metro Vancouver tourism struggling, even now that we can travel across BC, what specifically will the province be doing to help support Metro Vancouver operators if there is no international travel for a while here?
Thanks, Richard. I think the first question was to me, and we did discuss both interprovincial and international travel. The government of Alberta will be lifting our advisory against non-essential interprovincial and international travel when we get to our full reopening, which will be at the beginning of July, around July the 1st or 2nd. And I understand from John said that Premier Horgan said that BC will be effectively doing the same thing with respect to lifting the advisory against interprovincial travel. I think we've all tried in the West to the greatest extent possible to allow for movement of people because our economies and communities are so closely integrated, while at the same time discouraging non-essential travel. I think we're going to move beyond that. And I can certainly tell you, there are a lot of vaccinated, double-dosed Albertans who are really looking forward to going west and visiting with family and friends in BC this summer. And I very much hope that they'll be able to do so. And we will certainly welcome British Columbia visitors and commend BC on getting up to 76% first dose coverage. Good on British Columbia. With respect to international travel, Alberta's position is that we should facilitate a safe reopening of the U.S. border as soon as we reasonably can. I'd like to see that happen early in July. This is massively holding back our economy. What we see in the United States is that COVID does not pose a significant public health threat. There are some small localized exceptions to that, but generally you've seen in the across the United States, COVID numbers continue to fall with strong vaccination numbers. And in Canada, we're well ahead of them now in terms of first dose coverage. So I do think we need to exercise some targeted caution on international travel from areas of outbreaks, particularly with contagious variants. But there's protocols that we can follow, like facilitating easier travel for people who are fully vaccinated. And I know that a number of us as premiers will be bringing those ideas to the federal government.
And thank you, Richard, for the question. I'll just wait to camera to come by. There we go. We have been working as premiers, the Western premiers, as well as at the COF table, the Council of Federation, on borders for some weeks now. This is obviously a federal responsibility, and I'm grateful that the current administration is seeking guidance and input from all of us. We'll be doing that on Thursday in a meaningful way. Staff have been at this for some time. And I agree with Jason to the extent that we need to have a targeted approach to this. I think we all agree that there are some parts of the world that are further advanced than others in terms of vaccinations. I want to see a clear plan from the federal government on how they're going to monitor who's coming, how they're coming, by air, by land, by sea when it comes to BC. And these are issues that obviously not just the tourism industry are concerned about. All British Columbians, indeed all Canadians, want to get back to something resembling normal. All of us are challenging that issue of what exactly normal is going to be, and that's going to take time and patience, and I would suggest caution. That is, again, a quintessential Canadian response, I believe. We're all going to be in this together, so we all want to take that first step with the leadership, of course, falling to the senior government or the senior order of government to make those calls. That's their jurisdiction. But we all have a role to play here, and I'm grateful we have that opportunity. We'll have more to say, obviously, come Thursday after we've had that First Minister's Conference.
Thanks so much, Premier Horgan. Next, we have Lisa Cordasco from the Vancouver Sun.
Thank you. I would like to follow up on that question of international travel. Is there a consensus among Western premiers that you will present to the Prime Minister on your thoughts about when the international border should open and how?
Well, perhaps I'll start with that, Lisa, as a Vancouver Sun question, and then my colleagues will fit in. I think there's absolute consensus that we want to get back as quickly as possible to whatever normal will be. But we also expect the federal government to be leading on this question. We were the first province to call for the borders to be closed way back last March. We had unanimity on that question shortly thereafter. But since that time, there has been a back and forth across Canada, as you would expect, north and south, east and west, about what's the best way forward. And what I think we would all agree on is that over the past 15 months, over some 31 meetings with the federal government and 44, I think, amongst ourselves, is that we have a much clearer understanding of the give and take that makes Canada so unique, and why we need to continue to work together to collaborate on consensus before we go forward. That's what Canadians, I think, expect of us, and that's, I'm very grateful, is what all of my colleagues have been doing over the past short while. And come Thursday, we expect the federal government to have a plan, and then we'll work on building consensus around that.
Thank you very much, Premier Horgan. Next, we have Ian, and I'm so sorry if I'm saying this wrong, Froes from CBC Manitoba.
Hello, good afternoon. Premier, this question is for Premier Pallister. In terms of, I guess, what are we looking for in terms of the easing of interprovincial restrictions in Manitoba? And then, like, were there discussions on that front? And then what about sort of a vaccination card, which you've introduced? Could there be some level of standardization being sought?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Any question on reopening of borders is inseparably linked with vaccination uptake. And so we did spend some time talking about the importance of promoting and encouraging vaccines to be advanced and to be taken. We've tied our reopening schedule here in Manitoba directly to uptake on first and second vaccines as well. But clearly, the higher the uptake, the more security Canadians will enjoy. You know, old targets of herd immunity have disappeared as variants have arisen that increase the threat of rapid transmission. And so any discussion around reduction of border barriers has to also recognize the reality of the vaccine as the way out of this mess. As far as cards, no, we didn't have a lot of discussion on cards. As you know, different provinces are at different levels of discussion on whether that would be a useful tool. Our card is one that'll enable those who are double vaxxed plus 2 weeks to be able to travel without restriction, to be able to return from, and also for those who prove that they have been double vaxxed plus 2 weeks from any other jurisdiction enter into Manitoba. That will start to facilitate movement. The ultimate goal is, of course, to have no barriers as we once enjoyed without thinking about it. And we want to get back to that situation. We can't get there unless we have uptake on vaccine that is very, very significant and much higher than the old numbers we used to talk about.
Thank you, Premier Pallister. Next, we have Haley Richardson from Yukon News. Haley, we can't hear you. There's obviously an issue there, so I'm going to come back to you shortly. I'm not sure what's going on. Next, we'll take a question from Audrey Nouveau from Radio-Canada.
Hi, my question is for all the premiers who are present today. Alberta will hold a referendum in October to ask Albertans if they want to remove the clause of the Constitution relating to equalization payments. Would the premiers present today support constitutional talks on the equalization principle should Albertans decide to remove the clause in this referendum?
Audrey, est-ce que vous voulez en français et en anglais?
Certainement, merci.
Okay, I'll go first because it's an Alberta initiative. First in English, then French, and then any of my colleagues who might want to respond. So Audrey, as you know, this is a commitment we made in the last election to give Albertans a chance to speak to the unfairness with which our province has been treated in the Federation. We are proud Canadians, proud to have been able to share much of our good fortune with other parts of the country when times were good here and bad elsewhere. But what Albertans can't accept is the notion that we've been making net contributions through our federal taxes of over $20 billion a year, even as we've gone through 5 tough years in our economy, while some other provinces have benefited enormously from that, even while they've been experiencing lower unemployment and higher growth. But what really irks Albertans is that some governments across the country that have benefited from equalization have supported policies that have damaged our economy and try to block pipelines, for example, to create the wealth that we can share across the Federation. This referendum is really just an opportunity for Albertans to speak to this deep frustration. I think Albertans want to be constructive partners in the Canadian Federation. We demonstrated that through COVID, sharing our surplus personal protective equipment, helping out other provinces whenever and wherever we could. We want to continue playing that role. But we want to do it on a fair basis, and we want to send a message to our fellow Canadians in some parts of the country that if they want to benefit from the equalization dollars that are generated partly from Alberta's resources, then they have to let us develop those resources in a safe and responsible way. I'll say that briefly in French. Le référendum sur la péréquation est un engagement important dans les dernières élections en Alberta. C'est une occasion pour les Albertains à soulever leur inquiétude de l'injustice fiscale envers l'Alberta. Nous sommes les Canadiens fiers et généreux et nous voulons continuer à partager nos richesses, mais il faut que les autres gouvernements nous permettent de le faire. Il y a certains gouvernements qui ont profité de transferts fiscaux, y compris de péréquation, même quand l'Alberta était dans une récession grave et certains autres gouvernements se sont opposés au projet de ressources naturelles, y compris les oléoducs. Et alors, le référendum, c'est tout simplement une occasion pour les Albertains à demander un traitement plus juste dans la Fédération canadienne.
Merci. Next, we'll go to Josh Aldrich from the Winnipeg Sun.
Good afternoon. This is for Premier Pallister. The release talks about nation building through infrastructure projects. When we look at Manitoba, is this primarily increased sale of hydroelectricity interprovincially, or are we looking more at highway infrastructure as a means of moving goods? What role do you see Manitoba playing in this? What was discussed during the meetings?
Well, we all understand that the value of developing resources is particularly appropriate and important post-pandemic for Western Canada, and not exclusively us either. And partnerships across our region and across the country are vital in getting goods to market, whatever they may be. Energy is got buyers out there, and we've got the production for it. And so whether it's hydroelectric or other products, we're ready to go, and some type of corridor, some type of focus on transport of those products is vital. But we also need supportive partnerships that can facilitate these projects being developed. And that's a red tape issue of some annoyance, as you know, Josh, to us here in Manitoba. We've been working now for over half a decade to get a ditch dug to protect people from flooding in part of our province. And this is where work with the federal government is vitally important in order to help facilitate the development of certain projects such as these, whether it's a Trans Mountain pipeline or it's a ditch to protect people in flood situations. These are vitally important projects to move us forward, in particular post-pandemic, where the jobs they create and the opportunity to create more wealth is, as we all know, inseparably linked to supporting our social services such as healthcare, which is vitally important as we move forward and always has been and always will be.
Do you have a follow-up, Josh? Not hearing that, we'll move on to Mathis Hervé from Nunavut Radio-Canada.
Yeah, my question is for Premier Savikataaq. I'd like to know what cooperation opportunities would they be with your counterparts in terms of infrastructure projects and development in Nunavut?
Thank you, Mathis. The cooperation would be if any large infrastructure projects interprovincial would be considered or built, but the bulk of the cooperation is that as the Western Premiers, we speak as a unified group, and if there's an infrastructure issue that is pressing within Nunavut, I know that I can count on my Western and Northern premiers to help me in terms of our ask or request to the federal government. Thank you.
Did you have a follow-up, Matisse? Not hearing one, we will move on to Trevor Wright with Nunavut News.
Hi, this is Trevor Wright with Nunavut News and NWT News North. I got a couple of questions for Caroline and Joe. What have your respective governments been working on with regards to travel bubbles between other provinces and territories?
I guess I'll start then, and Joe, you can take on after. So we already have exemption basis. We're not talking travel bubbles anymore. We're talking exemptions. So with Nunavut, we've had that for quite a while, and we recently started one with the Yukon territories as well. But I think all jurisdictions are wanting to open up. People are tired of COVID-19. As stated before, we need to find out what the new normal will be. So, but for us in the Northwest Territories, it's not based on a firm date. It's based on our vaccinations, and it's based on the case counts in the South. So we did discuss it this morning in our meetings, and I really emphasized to all of the Southern jurisdictions, keep pumping out the vaccinations, because if we can get your people vaccinated, then we can actually open up. So I think right across, we all want to open up, and vaccinations is the key. And so please, if you haven't been vaccinated, please do your part and get vaccinated. Thank you.
Thank you, Trevor. Here in Nunavut, as you're aware, just yesterday, anyone that is fully vaccinated now, whether they're the Nunavut residents or anyone from Canada, as long as they can prove that they're fully vaccinated, both doses, that they can come into Nunavut now without doing a 14-day isolation. Anyone that is not vaccinated then still has to do the 14 days isolation before they can come into Nunavut. Thank you.
Thanks, Premier Savikataaq. We'll move on now to Arthur from the Regina Leader Post.
Yes, thank you. This is for Premier Scott Moe. Arthur White-Crummey here. I wanted to ask, I was able to read the request that you sent to the federal government today regarding international travel. And I'm wondering if this is such an urgent issue for the economy, then why do we continue to have a recommendation in this province that tells people that they should not travel interprovincially? Have you actually given any thought to perhaps lifting that in the near future? And have there been any talks today with your provincial counterparts to, perhaps coordinate on that particular issue, sort of interprovincial travel?
Yeah, there is, and some of my colleagues may have a comment on this as well, as we did have some discussion on, where we are at with our comfort level with respect to interprovincial travel across, across our provinces and across Canada ultimately. We're pretty clear on interprovincial travel, and the recommendation that we have in Saskatchewan, it'll be lifted. We'll hit our benchmark by this Sunday, which will be June the 20th. That'll allow us 3 weeks out to July 11th to be moving on phase 3 and the ultimate full implementation of all of our phases in removing all of the COVID restrictions that we have, and that will include any travel recommendations, not orders, but travel recommendations around interprovincial travel, asking people to not travel unless it's absolutely necessary. And there are people that have traveled, and it is absolutely necessary for numerous people. We've mentioned, for instance, the city of Lloydminster. We actually share with the province of Alberta, as part of it is on the Alberta side of the provincial border, and part of it is on the Saskatchewan side. So we've been very clear with what the plan is here in Saskatchewan, and that's ultimately what we've asked the federal government to do as well. We didn't say we need to remove the quarantine that didn't need to remove the quarantine that is present for the international quarantine that is present and needs to be adhered to by everyone that is returning, whether they're fully vaccinated, whether they're Canadian, whether they're a non-Canadian resident. Everyone needs to abide by that quarantine, and that isn't the case in the interprovincial travel from Saskatchewan's perspective, but which will be lifted on July 11th. But what we've asked the federal government for is to put forward what their plan is on when Canadians, in particularly fully vaccinated Canadians, would have the opportunity to not only not have to reside in a federally approved facility for those first number of days, but when would fully vaccinated people, Canadians in particular, but ultimately at some point everyone, be able to enter Canada without that quarantine, that 14-day quarantine period. It may be a phased-in approach that involves a test, and it may be a day or two quarantine until the test result is there. I don't know what it is, but what we are asking the federal government for is to communicate to people, Canadians, what their plan is on how we are going to allow for travel, because it is important. It is important not only for families to meet families, and I have friends that are thinking about how they would be able to reunite with their family in India, for example. But it's also important if we're going to have a full, robust economic recovery. As our province and our nation is an export-based, we're an export-based economy. We do deal out of Saskatchewan with over 160 countries each and every year. We're very proud of the relationships that we have with those countries, and that we can for a period of time communicate like we are here today digitally, but sooner or later it does require people to travel again for us to fully realize the economic recovery that we feel and the opportunities economically that we feel lie before us. We did discuss this just briefly. If there's any other premiers that would like to comment, feel free.
I don't see any other premiers with their hands up. Arthur, did you have a follow-up?
Yes, I do have one follow-up. I'm not sure I was out for the first question, so this may have been addressed, but if not, I just wanted to ask Premier Moe, I know that there was a statement within the joint communique about the need to continue to search unmarked graves within provinces, but there's no actual funding commitment for this yet. And I do see that Ontario has already committed $10 million. So I wanted to know why Saskatchewan and why some of the other Western provinces have not yet been able to make a funding commitment to actually locate these graves.
I'll speak to Saskatchewan's position, and others may want to weigh in on this as well, as this is, we did discuss this in I believe it was the very first question to some degree. But we most certainly are there to assist and to provide support. Some of that, yes, maybe financial support as we move forward to undertake an effort to not only identify any unmarked grave sites that we may have here in this province, but also to work with our Indigenous people, Indigenous partners to start to provide some closure to many families that may not know what had occurred to their brother, their sister, their family member, or their friend. So if that is, if there's financial supports that are required, and we are discussing this with our Indigenous partners right now, we're not opposed to providing those financial supports. We see what Ontario has provided today, and commend Premier Ford on stepping forward with that financial commitment, and also commend the federal government for providing in excess of $20 million for this effort as well, to not only fund some of the identification and of the grave sites and what may have happened to these individuals, but also to look at how we properly commemorate what has occurred here. Premier Horgan, pardon me, had spoken earlier to some of the work that him and Premier Silver are doing that was planned in prior to the confirmation of the grave sites at Kamloops. We in Saskatchewan as well will be very shortly commemorating and unveiling an initiative from our Lieutenant Governor, the Honorable Russ Marasti, which is really a commemoration and an opportunity and a monument to Indian residential schools survivors and their families right here at Government House in Regina, and that will happen very, very shortly. Again, that's an initiative that was previous to the confirmation of these unmarked grave sites at Kamloops, but an indication of the road that we are traveling in this nation and need to continue to travel in this nation.
Could I just jump in here to say that first, we should also recognize, as did the Missing Children and Unmarked Grave project of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, that a great deal of work has been done on trying to identify remains at or associated with residential schools. And what we should acknowledge the many years of hard work led by First Nations in that area. So the deeply disturbing revelations in Kamloops is not the beginning of the process, but hopefully it motivates all of us as Canadians to do everything possible to identify other unmarked graves. And now, when you ask about provincial governments, the residential school system was a federal system, and they carry the primary responsibility here. But I don't think this is an issue where we want to play focus on legal jurisdiction. We just all have to do our part. And as Premier of Northwest Territories said, this has to be done with Indigenous communities leading the way. And governments need to be supportive and respond respectfully in providing resources as they need it, when and where they need it.
Thank you so much for that. I did get a little overexcited in my new moderating role, and I did skip over follow-up questions from Audrey from Radio Canada and Ian from CBC Manitoba. So if we could quickly circle back to them. Audrey, you can go first, and then Ian, please.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I will ask my question again, as I heard from Premier Kenney. Thank you very much. But I also want to hear from the other premiers present today. Will you support constitutional talks on the equalization principle if Albertans vote to strike it down in the referendum in October?
I will speak from Saskatchewan's perspective, and yes, we will.
Did any other premiers want to speak to that? Not seeing any. Okay. We'll go to Ian at CBC Manitoba.
Yes, good afternoon again. Thank you. Premier Pallister, given that some other provinces are committing funds, as expressed here, to investigating and looking for unmarked graves, will Manitoba consider changing its stance and putting provincial money forward?
Well, we won't change our stance. Our stance was never against putting money towards this. We've been partnering with the federal government and First Nations communities already on a couple of projects. We'll continue to do that. And we're going to commit, as Caroline so wisely said, to following the TRC recommendations in respect of this and many other issues, because they have to be community partnership based if they're going to work to effectively heal. And we have to run at these issues, not away from them. And if there's any good to come from the greater awareness, I think there is, of the Kamloops exposure on this issue, it is that the real history and the real reality of our country needs to be looked at, scars and all, and it needs to be looked at together in a spirit of partnership. This is how we built this country, but we didn't build it perfectly, and we need to acknowledge that.
Thanks so much. We're now moving on to Bill Fortier at CTV News.
Hi, the question is for Premier Jason Kenney. The question, Premier, is Tim Uppal on Sunday apologized and said he regretted his role In the former federal conservative government's proposed niqab ban, Michelle Rempel-Garner also posted that she regretted not speaking out against it. As former immigration minister, you played a role. And also in 2015, you said some fairly negative things about niqabs. I'm wondering in 2021 if your views have changed and if you also, as Tim Uppal did, would apologize or would like to say something a little bit different about niqabs and about your role in that proposed ban back in the...
Well, they're actually, I've never supported a proposed ban. To the contrary, I've always said that Canada is a country that protects and respects religious freedom and pluralism, and the government has no business regulating what people wear. Unlike in certain European and Middle Eastern countries that do have bans on face coverings, that has never been proposed. I've always opposed that. In fact, when I was the federal minister for multiculturalism, I threatened to sue the then PQ government of Quebec on behalf of Canada for a proposed violation of the Constitution in banning ostensible religious symbols, including hijabs, niqabs, yarmulkes, crosses, etc., from people in the receiving or delivering public services. You know, my record on these matters is could not be more clear. As a Minister of Immigration who welcomed over 150,000 Muslims to Canada as new Canadians, who developed special refugee protection programs for persecuted Muslim minorities like the Rohingya victims of genocide in Burma, the Uyghur victims of genocide in China, the Ahmadis targeted for persecution in Pakistan, and others. I spoke out as Minister of Multiculturalism against proposed hijab bans, like from the Quebec Soccer Federation, and in fact was recognized for my close work with the Canadian Muslim community with awards like, for example, from the Association of Progressive Muslims of Canada. I have had the honor of visiting literally dozens of mosques and Islamic schools across the country. I have always defended public funding of Islamic independent schools and strengthened that and their rights here in Alberta through the School Choice Act, and have just this past week, as you know, our government announced additional measures to strengthen the prosecution of hate crimes. We announced the security infrastructure project at the Al Rashid Mosque in Edmonton, the oldest mosque in Canada, to help mosques and other vulnerable community institutions to harden their security against potential violence or vandalism. So we will continue to work closely and respectfully with the Muslim community in the best tradition of Canada's pluralism.
If I could just pitch in, there are very few people I've worked with in my elected life of public service who have done more genuinely to reach out and to really bring people together while recognizing the incredible multicultural nature of our country than Jason Kenney. And I would go further and say we were both proud to be part of a government that acknowledged and apologized for the residential schools a number of years ago. Actions that have followed are as a consequence in part of the work of the TRC that we established. You know, these aren't times to pull people against one another and see who's the most permissive of hate. These are times to pull people together and say who's the least permissive of hate. And I would say that Premier Kenney's record on that speaks volumes about his sincerity and respect of overcoming hate, just as this communique today is a genuine reflection of the attitudes of all the premiers who wrote it.
Thanks so much for that. We are going to take one last question because we are running against the clock here. We're already over. So the last question will be from Joanne Stassen at CBC. And thanks everyone. And I hope to see you in Nunavut someday soon.
Yeah, this question is for Premier Cochrane. I'm hoping you can hear me okay. I just wanted to ask, just maybe you could give us a little sense of, you know, we've talked a lot about COVID. We've talked about the impact of this recent finding at Kamloops School, but I'm wondering if you could give us a sense, coming out of this meeting, what's sort of been the most helpful thing about getting together with these other Western premiers that you're taking away from this meeting?
Thank you. So I've been a premier for 1.5 years, and I joined the table, and there's a lot more experienced premiers across the country. I think that COVID really brought forward the fact that although there's different party lines out there and different views and perspectives, the NWT is consensus government, so we've been kind of we were sheltered from a lot of the party lines. Is that when it comes to major issues such as COVID, infrastructure gaps, opportunities, cross-jurisdictional, parties don't matter. It's when we work together as all premiers that we do the best for the residents of Canada. And so the NWT is one jurisdiction in Canada, but I'm proud to say I'm a Canadian. And by working together, finding commonalities that we can all stand up for, that is the way, in my opinion, that we represent Canadians. And that is my stance, and that is my goal as we work forward into the rest of my term as Premier. And I'm picking up that all of us are on the same boat with that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all so much for attending the press conference for the 2021 Western Premiers Conference. If you have any follow-up questions, I suggest you reach out directly to the Premier's offices. Thanks so much, everyone.